Okay, this is the audio review for Exam 3, Soc 1. Okay, so for the first question, information revolution. This is obviously just the definition from your book. It's the recent social revolution made possible because of developments of the microchip in the 1970s, and as a result of which we now can manage information much more efficiently. Capitalism versus socialism. There I'm looking for you knowing the difference between the economic systems, right? Capitalism is an economic system based on the laws of free market and private ownership of the means of production, while socialism is an economic system based on collective ownership of the means of production. All nations' economies have both aspects, meaning there aren't true democracies or true socialism in a real way. Like if you look at the socialist economy of China has a lot of capitalistic effects, and even our very capitalistic economy has socialized effects like we discuss in the film with, police, firefighters, libraries, stuff like that. Collective resistance strategies are those ways that basically unions got together to fight for workers' rights. So there's some of the things that we take for granted that come as a result of those collective resistance strategies would be having weekends, right? Having all the people that are employed actually be over 18 or at least have a work permit to work, meaning not having child labor. There's a minimum wage, right, which didn't exist before union organizing. And of course the 8-hour workday, which before that it was common to have 14 to 16-hour days. Alrighty. Marx argues that workers are alienated in 4 ways under capitalism. From the products of their labor, right? Since they don't get to control, the actual products that they make. And again, he was looking at this in the context of industrial capitalism, like right at the advent. From their own productive activity, meaning they don't get to kind of choose the way that they create the parts that they create. From their fellow workers, because once wages are kept so low, we see fellow workers as competition instead of allies. And really from human nature, because he argues that if you aren't able to do something with your life that you're passionate about, then that is kind of essentially taking away a part of your humanity. Post-industrial economy. Just that now that we're in this post-industrial economy, at least in our country, a lot more workers do either knowledge work or service work, right? Service work being those kind of retail jobs that are more about, helping people, customers, patients, something like that. And knowledge work is more about using your brain, dealing with levels of information, right? Globalization, just the definition from your book, the cultural, economic, and political changes resulting from dramatically increased international trade and exchange. Transnational corporations are companies that manufacture, distribute, and market goods all over the globe. And what they also do with a lot of their earnings is they like to push trade deals that benefit the companies that, are these transnational corporations while exploiting the workers. Let's see, Sweatshop Labor. So, these are jobs that are characterized by very little pay, long hours, often dangerous or strenuous conditions, right? So the video clip from chapter 11 gets into that, how the Triangle Factory Shirtwaist Fire was a kind of turning point in the union rights movement within our country, but almost 100 years later, almost the exact same thing happened in Bangladesh, but it wasn't considered a rallying cry around union rights. Actually, the guy who owned the factory just said that the workers sabotaged it, right? And so we think about sweatshops as something of the past, but really we've just moved the sweatshops from early 1900s America to everywhere else in the globe. Outsourcing is when basically you take a specific kind of job and you send it to another country, right? So someone in that country is contracted out to do a job that would otherwise be done in the US. So for example, like a phone bank, if you call a lot of 1-800 numbers, right? Maybe for your bank or I don't know, AAA, something like that, then oftentimes you'll get someone in another country, right? They speak English, they have the same credentials, degrees, experience, knowledge, but because of their deflated economy, they're willing to work for a lot less money. Third sector is the part of the economy that's comprised of nonprofit organizations and their workers and volunteers. And like we discussed, the issue with the third sector is, yes, it is very positive in our culture and it helps prop up a lot of people that are struggling in poverty, but in a lot of other industrialized countries like ourselves, or post-industrial countries like ourselves, they have actually developed better social safety nets so that this is done through the government and not something that has to be done by volunteers or out of the kindness of someone's heart. Because the real consequences, as wages deflate over time and as kids now have less money and opportunities than they ever did before, what likelihood do you have to volunteer your time when you have 3 jobs? What likelihood do you have to volunteer your money, right, to donate to a lot of these causes that are very worthy when you can barely scrape by when your rent is astronomical, right? All right, moving into chapter 14. Preventative medicine is a type of healthcare used to avoid or stall the onset of a disease, right? So going for a yearly checkup, for a physical, something like that. Acute versus chronic, just to know the difference between these illnesses. So a chronic disease is one that develops over a long period of time and often isn't detectable until symptoms occur later in the progression, versus an acute disease is something that has a sudden onset and can be briefly incapacitating and is either curable or fatal. So like an acute disease would be the flu, right? Versus a chronic illness would be something like diabetes or cancer. Medicalization is the process by which some behaviors, once seen as individual issues, are now seen as medical issues, right? We talked about the issues of obesity in that realm. A food desert, right? This is a community that has very little access to affordable, healthy food, and this is a consequence of the way that we've organized a lot of rural areas and low-income areas. Deprivation amplification. So this is this idea that you might have a genetic predisposition towards a particular illness, but your individual disease risks are intensified by the social factors or the social environment in which you live. So if you live in Los Angeles and you're predisposed towards respiratory illnesses, you're much more likely to develop them because of the smog, right? Cultural competence, again from your book, it's an acknowledgement and incorporation of a person's cultural background as part of the treatment process, which is important because patients' beliefs shape their approach to healthcare. So again, if you don't understand the different cultural nuances of different groups of people, then it's very difficult to provide them with adequate care. The sick role is how we expect that people kind of take on a different role when they're sick in our culture, right? They're exempted from their normal expectations, like you're allowed to stay home from school or stay home from work, right? And so it's something that we kind of expect people to do, but there's a certain expectation that you will take that time to rest and get better. Rescission is a practice by insurance companies of canceling coverage after someone gets sick, right? Even though they've paid their premiums, they go back, like you saw in the film Sicko, and they try to find a way to cancel someone's coverage, largely because they consider paying out someone's coverage what they call a medical loss. So they lose money if you have your surgery. Bioethics are the study of controversial moral issues related to scientific and medical advancements, right? So some of the issues around bioethics today deal with GMOs and other issues of our food system, a lot of the additives and problems that we have, plus the issue of, really not really caring for the overall environment, something we'll talk about a little bit more with 16 as well. With 15 as well. All right, so then for Sicko, for the movie Sicko, what were the differences in the medical systems around the world? Well, obviously, as you saw, all the other medical systems had free universal healthcare versus us. The ideological values is just that, he says at the very end of the film, they have an ideology of we instead of me. Right? And then he says we have to change that before anything else can change, right? So the ideological value of selfishness, of me, mine, kind of undermines this more solidarity mindset that underlies universal healthcare. So it's important how a society believes or their value systems when it comes to these kind of notions as to whether or not you can convince them to change a system. All right, moving on to chapter 15. So the Malthusian theorem, right, is the kind of Chicken Little, the sky's falling, but not really. But anyway, it states that exponential population growth will outpace arithmetic growth in food production and other resources. So again, remember, he thought, let's say a person marries another person and has 12 kids. Now, if those 12 kids have 12 kids, basically the people outpace how much food can be grown for them. So if food is arithmetic, meaning you plant, I don't know, 50 ears of corn, you get 50 ears of corn. It's not like each ear of corn then has 20 ears of corn itself, which then have 20 ears of corn itself. Each what you plant is what you get, versus with people. And again, Malthusian was developing this theory in a time period where people had a lot of kids. Nowadays, the average birth rate has fallen quite a bit. But so he just assumed that there'd be way more people than there would be food to feed them. Urbanization is the movement of increasing numbers of people from rural areas into cities. Urban density is the concentration of people in a city, measured by the total number of people per square mile. Urban sprawl is a derogatory term applied to the expansion of urban and suburban boundaries associated with poorly planned development, right? So the fact that there's a strip mall in every foreseeable location that used to just be like a field or grass is now concrete and filled with a 7-Eleven. White flight was the movement of upper and middle class whites who could afford to leave the cities for the suburbs in the 1950s and 60s. Right? And remember, during this time period, there was a lot of, especially when service members got back in the late 40s from World War II, there were a lot of service members that got the GI Bill and were able to use that money to get a home loan. But during that time period, these suburbs, as they were being built, were racially exclusive, meaning they were only for whites. And literally the deeds for the house said whites only on it. So it basically left a situation where a lot of lower middle class and working class whites had the opportunity to move to the suburbs and gain a middle class status, but poor people of color that served in the same war were not able to. Gentrification is the transformation of the physical, social, economic, and cultural life of formerly working class or poor inner city neighborhoods into more affluent middle class communities. So this is like the example I gave that, downtown Anaheim, near where I live, there's now like 3 vegan places I can eat, right? Which is not the case before they did their, quote, revitalization, or, what we call gentrification of the downtown area. And that while it may cause a short-term uptick in financial revenues for a certain particular location, the larger societal consequence is, where do people go when the rents get so damn high that literally nobody can afford it anywhere, right? Like the situation that's going on in San Francisco right now, where people that have lived there for literally generations are now not even able to afford a studio apartment. All right, utopia versus dystopia, just the difference. A utopia is an ideal society free of social problems. And a dystopia is a world where social problems are magnified, right? So you could just think about your favorite sci-fi films or sci-fi stuff. There's some of them are utopias, some of them are dystopias, right? The utopia is like the Star Trek, right? Or more of a dystopia would be Star Wars, right? All right, bystander effect is the social dynamic where the more people that are present in a moment of crisis, the less likely one of them is to take action. And the example we had for this was the Kitty Genovese effect, right? Where more than 30 people watched her get stabbed to death or heard her get stabbed to death on the street, yet no one called the police because they all assumed someone else would do it. Environmental sociology is the study of the interaction between society and the natural environment, including the social causes and consequences of environmental problems. So we try to understand it from a perspective of, how do our social understandings affect the way that we actually treat the environment? Let's see here. So the 4 areas of environmental sociology are how the political economy influences the environment. So political economy there meaning, how it is that we make, manufacture, distribute goods. How does that affect the environment? The second area of environmental sociology is society's attitudes about the environment, right? Most of our kind of recent history, we've seen the environment as something to be conquered or dominated, right? And not something that we're a part of. The environmental movement is the third area of environmental sociology, seeing how people collectivize and move towards social goals. And then the fourth would be sustainable development, right? Trying to find ways to sustainably recreate the systems that we have. So this could be something like, electric cars, right? Or, finding ways to grow our foods or have our food systems recreated so that they're not so destructive. Because one of those things that we don't really talk about is how our food choices have more of an impact on global warming than what car we drive in, or if we take public transportation. Let's see here. Biodiversity is just the variety of species of plants and animals existing at any given time. Right now, we're in a mass extinction where, thousands of species are, gone each week. The political economy of the environment is a neo-Marxist or Weberian approach to looking at the environment, right? The kind of conflict theory approach, looking at how organizations and corporations use the environment and how that's supported by political systems and politics, because the corporations line politicians' pockets, so they skirt the rules, they look the other way when it comes to environmental regulations. Human exceptionalism is this attitude that humans are exempt from natural ecological limits, right? So kind of we're better than the environment. We can conquer the environment instead of seeing ourselves as part of it. Environmental racism is an environmental policy that negatively affects individuals, groups, or communities because of their race or ethnicity, right? And so some of the video clips that were in that section talked about how, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and how, there's this problem of environmental racism where people of color are not just working in industries that have the most toxic chemicals, but they also tend to live in areas that have the dumps or petrochemical plants and these other contaminants that affect their drinking water, that affect their air that they breathe, and affect their health outcomes and lifespan. Grassroots environmentalism is a movement that emerged in response to this kind of perceived blind spot of the larger mainstream groups, which focuses much more on local action and community involvement. And then an ecological footprint is just the estimation of land and water it would require to produce all the goods one individual consumes and to assimilate all the waste that she generates. So, for example, it would be like, how many planets would it take to support if everybody ate and transported and lived the way that you do, right? All right, moving on to chapter 16. Social change, right? So pretty much the most important contribution to social change has come through collective action. It's when people get together and work together towards change that change is effective. So that's basically that. Social change, most important contribution to social change. It's just a transformation of a culture over time, right? Collective behavior is the behavior that follows from the formation of a group or crowd of people who take action together towards a shared goal, right? So the part of it that makes it collective is the shared goal. Contagion theory is one of the earliest theories of collective behavior that suggests that individuals who join a crowd are, quote, infected with mob mentality and lose their ability to reason. Versus emergent norm theory that really thinks that individuals still, even if they're in a crowd, still make decisions about their own behavior, and that during the crowd itself, norms are kind of made and reformed about what's appropriate behavior. Let's see here. Oh, tragedy of the commons is a type of social dilemma where many individuals overexploit a public resource, and that depletes or degrades that common resource, right? So if, you want to go to a pristine... Oh, actually, a good example of this would be the recent issue that happened with the super bloom, right? Where there was a lot of blooming happening in California, and of course people wanted to see it, but instead of just seeing it, they wanted to take selfies with it to put on Instagram. So they walked and sat and squished and killed all the plants so that they could take pictures with them, right? So if everybody could just go look at it without destroying it, that'd be one thing. But it's that part where, if one person goes and looks at it, fine. But if thousands of people do it, it destroys everything. All right, so the Voting Rights Act is an example of relative deprivation theory to explain social movements. right? Because relative deprivation theory says that oppressed groups try to seek rights that are enjoyed by other groups in society by, aggressing them through a social movement, right? And so the Voting Rights Act specifically tried to make poll taxes, literacy tests, and other actions that prevented minorities from voting illegal, because even though the Civil Rights Act dealt with voting, it still didn't actually deal with the specific ways that, especially in the South, African Americans were being restricted from voting. And again, another issue with that is that a key provision of the Voting Rights Act was repealed in about 2010, when basically it was said that it wasn't needed anymore by the Supreme Court, by the stacked Supreme Court, that basically said that if a state historically discriminated against people of color, then if they wanted to make a change to their voting laws, there would have to be an oversight to that, right? But that was overturned, and since it was overturned, over 19 states have implemented photo ID laws. All right, moving on to Mauss's 4 stages of social movements tend to go through. So basically, first, the public defines the problem, right? And that's the first stage where, okay, we say this is a social problem, this is something that needs to be addressed. And the second part is people start to organize, right? They start to, come together, protest, collectivize. And the third stage it gets to is the movement becomes bureaucratized, meaning there becomes its own structure, it becomes its own kind of behemoth of itself, right? That it becomes more structured, more legal, more about working within the kind of bureaucratic systems that we already have. And then as a result of that, in the fourth stage, the movement begins to decline, right? Let's see, regressive movements versus progressive movements. So regressive, progressive. If you know the difference between pro, then you're good, right? Regressive just means backwards, progressive means forward, right? So regressive movements are movements that attempt to resist social change or maintain the status quo or go back to an earlier form of social order. So a good example of that would be Make America Great Again, right? This idea that America was like super great at some point. But when you think about it, sure, like that, like from certain like objective measures, definitely, right? We used to tax the rich over 90%. That's why it was so great. But anyway, but what we don't think about is, when was America better for women? When was it better for people of color? When was America better for LGBTQ folks? Never. So when we talk about making America great again, that means making America great going back to the time periods before the women's rights movement, the queer rights movement, the civil rights movement, when people knew their place, right? So that's regressive. Let's go backwards, right? While progressive are movements that promote forward-thinking social change, right? So Black Lives Matter, or, Occupy, right? Those kind of progressive, moving towards the future. How do we change things for the better ongoing into the future, instead of how do we move backwards, right? Cultural diffusion is the spread of materials and non-material culture to new cultural groups regardless of the movements of people, right? Let's see. Cultural imperialism is how cultures are influenced through adopting another culture's products, right? So you don't have to roll in a tank. You just basically, by buying Coca-Cola, right, then certain American values get spread throughout these things, or, American media, right, causes a lot of this. And then cultural leveling is how societies lose their uniqueness and become increasingly similar, right? The more and more that we trade with each other, that we expand, that we have the similar technologies, then we become much more similar. Well, hopefully this is helpful. This is your review, and yeah.